Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to be here. And hope you're not feeling nervous, okay? So, in the presentation, okay? Relax. Okay, what I wanted to do is just really introduce a topic which is very much in its early days, which is my particular area of Muslim youth studies. I'm going to go through a few slides, so bear with me. If there is anything that I present which you're not sure about, actually don't mind stopping and clarifying it. So if you need to stop me, stop me. Otherwise, I'll speak to the slides if that's okay. I must say, my apologies to Sophie, I should have said. Thank you very much, Sophie, for inviting me here at university. Great to be here. Okay, Azim. What I want to concentrate on in this presentation is these areas really, which is just to give you an overview if you're not already aware of the kind of demographic breakdown of the British Muslim community. Looking at some of the issues that are pertinent to British Muslim youth, specifically education, housing, employment, and some of the other kind of main social indicators really that give you an indication of the situation of Muslims youth in generally speaking, but specifically Muslim youth. And what I'm trying to present to you in this presentation is an overview. It's an overview. Each one of these particular areas could be gone into great depth, but I don't want to overload you with that. I'll just try to give you a flavour really, if you like, of these topic areas. Moving on, I want you to begin to appreciate some of the diversity of the Muslim communities, and that's not always so evident in popular imagination. When you're looking at the media, Muslims are often presented as some kind of monolithic entity, but we are a Muslim community. It's a community of communities, like any other community. There's no such thing as a Christian community, really. It's made up of various different kinds of Christians that kind of come under the banner of a Christian community. But I kind of really resist this thing about when we talk about a Muslim community out there. So that's one of the things I'll come back to. I'll mention also some of the kind of highlights of the emerging literature. I don't know if some of you I think are students on the program here, so you might want to take a few references here. And then I'll round off by talking about some of the issues and concerns that young people themselves are actually articulating. Next slide, please.
Sure.
To begin with, okay, you may or may not know that the Muslim community, as it was recorded in the 2001 census anyway, which is now quite dated, it was recorded at 1.6. So, interestingly, I think it was 2 weeks ago, a Labour Force survey came up with a new figure of 2.4 million. Now that's an official increase of 800,000 just in the last 8 years. Now, I haven't actually looked into it in depth yet, but it does. Well, we do know that the 2001 figures are quite out of date now. But now, interestingly, out of that figure, if we say 2 million for argument's sake, more than half of that is under the age of 25, and that's quite significant. So what it does, it represents a very young population, relatively speaking, and that the Muslim community itself is most probably the fastest growing minority community, faith community, out of all the population, and that's very important. Again, you probably won't be surprised to know that the majority of the population is of a South Asian complexion, meaning either from Pakistan, Bangladesh, or India. But at the same time, there is a significant proportion from the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia, as well as Europe. And let's not forget, there is a emerging convert community as well. It says here 46% of Muslims born in the UK. I think that figure's increased now again because I'm using 2001 data here. Some of the, I probably don't need to talk every single point because it's quite self-evident. Perhaps people will know that there's about about just over 50% of the Muslim population live in the London area, and the rest are scattered geographically in the Midlands, Leicester, the Birmingham areas, the Northwest, Greater Manchester, as well as the smaller towns, Burnleys, the Blackburns, the Burys, the Rochdales, and the Oldhams. And let's not forget Scotland, Northern Ireland, and of course Wales. Now, again, some of the figures are kind of dated, but that's because the compliance information actually does take quite a lot of time, and by the time it's published, it becomes dated once again. But some of the more recent figures are, again, here for your to look at. I mean, what I wanted to kind of get across in some of these statistics that, again, I don't know if you know, but relatively speaking, British Muslim young people are underachieving in education. And that's quite a cause of concern, really. Particularly the boys. But I might not be surprised to girls, but you know, boys aren't doing well, and that's reflected both in their GCSE grades, as well as the options that they take beyond that if they do go into FE level, A levels, or equivalent qualifications. But there are some differences at degree level which I won't get into. Moving on to the area of housing. Again, I suppose the prominent feature here in terms of Muslim communities is that we tend to have large families, but our housing situations, particularly in the cities, is less than adequate, with a lot of families actually struggling with overcrowding and being located in poorer housing stock, especially in the northern towns. And this has been quite an issue actually, because that impacts again on educational achievement. If you've got no space to do your homework, you know, that's an issue. Again, educational underachievement, it spills over into employment prospects. And again, if you look at some of the statistics around where Muslims are, what kind of career options they're taking, we again, relatively speaking, overrepresented in manual and unskilled labour kind of sectors. And not only that, there is high levels of unemployment. In some places, it can be between 30, even 40%, which you can imagine is a real problem. When you can't find a job, or you haven't got skills to get the kind of job that you want, it can lead to involvement in alternative ways of securing income, if you know what I mean. Now, again, that's just part of the picture. What I want, I suppose, to stress at the same time is that, you know, these kind of quite grim statistics, the poverty indicators again, as well as the education underachievement, underemployment or unemployment rates, they're only part of the picture. There is an increasingly successful section of the Muslim community that is doing very well, actually. Educational achievements are high. The educational underachievements I talked about, again, is relative to which section of the Muslim community we're talking about. For example, the Indian Muslim communities are actually doing very well. Their average GCSE pass rate and A-level pass rate is much higher than their Pakistani and Bengali counterparts. And it's Pakistani and Bengali communities that are kind of struggling, and there are reasons for that as well. I mean, I'm throwing a lot of statistics at you, but you must understand there are socio-cultural reasons for that. But that's a different presentation. Moving on to crime. Okay. The most startling statistic here for me is the fact that around 10% and I've read recently it's actually increased to more than 10% of the British prison population is Muslim inmates. It's a shocking figure, given the fact that the Muslim community itself represents around 3% of the total population. Again, there are social reasons for that. There are young men, and their involvement tends to be. Can I go back? A lot of the kind of the actual sentencing is drugs related activity. So just to bear that in mind. Young Muslims have complained since particularly 9/11 and certainly after the terrorist attacks of 7/7 that the increase in stop and search has kind of like just gone through the roof, really. And again, it's part of the kind of social problem and a kind of social grievance that a lot of young Muslims have, which I'll come on to later. Now, moving on to the diversity of Muslim communities. Like any community, we have many internal differences. First thing I'd like to suggest to you is that when you think of Muslims, what's the first thing that comes into your head in terms of their kind of their religion and the association you have with young Muslims and their religion? Is that there's a kind of impression. Would you agree there's an impression that when you think of Muslims, it's always the headlines in the newspapers are Islam and youth, Islam and militancy, Islam and extremism? You get the impression that all Muslims are religious. Would you agree with that? It comes across like that. But the fact of the matter is, actually, the majority of us are not. We're not. The youth, specifically, are not practicing their religion. Believe it or not, that's the reality. They emotionally, they are Muslims. In terms of, if you ask them about their faith, they'll tell you they're Muslims. But if you ask them, do you actually uphold the kind of practices of your faith? Do you pray? Do you pray 5 times a day? And do you do all of the associated rites? They'll probably tell you no. Well, they'd like to. That's something. First of all, I'd like to make clear. Secondly, there's huge differences in terms of people's understandings of their religion, and this can be to do with their interpretation of the religion in terms of their adherence to a particular school of law. It can be in relation to the sectarian orientation which they were brought up in. It can also be the obvious factors like their country of origin, their ethnicities, their nationalities, where they live in the UK has an impact. And the kind of cultures which they are part of and cultures which they are inventing. So it's a very dynamic phenomena. The Muslim community is not static. Again, as outsiders, people might think, well, you think of the Muslim community, you might have an image in your head that they're like this and they, behave like that. And if you don't understand, if you've not mixed with Muslim communities, you're not really going to know that actually the community is very diverse. And there are a lot of divisions. There are a lot of internal disagreements and tensions, rivalries between different communities. And increasingly now you're seeing a division based upon class. Because remember I said there's a up-and-coming successful section of the Muslim community. They're actually becoming quite middle class and aspirational, and hence you're starting to see a bit of a division between them and their peers who are not doing so well. So there is a bit of a class kind of division developing now, and you see that as well in terms of attitudes. It's interesting. It's an interesting thing which I'm looking at myself. And again, obviously, people's class differences can affect their political allegiances and participation in different types of political activism. Historically, Muslims used to support the Labour Party, but particularly since the invasion of Iraq, Muslims have in the UK decided to be a bit more strategic in what they vote for. And there have been campaigns and there's been lobbying internally in the community that say that, look, the Labour Party was good for us in the past, but they're not, you know, they're not necessarily the best party for us now. And you know, people have advocated joining different groups. So some people have joined the Liberal Democrats, others have joined the Conservative Party, others have joined the Respect Coalition. So that's an interesting example of the different types of politics. And obviously there are differences between communities on the basis of gender. Again, when we talk about the Muslim community, it's often always a male perspective. When we talk about, wittingly or unwittingly, when we're talking about community, we're really talking about the guys. You know, it's the guys you see on TV shouting and jumping around and screaming. Or it's the men who you see speaking in their broken English to the reporters. You know, so it's always very much a kind of a male kind of dominated representation. You very rarely hear the women. Am I right, sisters? No?
Is it our prominent speakers, women speakers as well nowadays?
Yeah, you don't hear the Muslim female voice, or you don't see it so often, and that's something that's changing, though, thankfully. Moving on. Some of the in terms of those Muslims who are committed to their faith, who are taking it seriously, that growing minority that's becoming religiously active can be separated into different strands, and I've just listed some of the more kind of dominant kind of movements that you see within the Muslim community. So you have the Brahmi community and the Deobandi community as representing the kind of traditional types of religious understanding and practice, particularly from South Asia. There are people in the second and third generation of Muslims who still kind of associate with that, but they're actually losing their appeal. The youngsters nowadays are more interested in the activist movements as represented by Islamist organisations such as the Young Muslims UK, Hizb ut-Tahrir, some of the Salafi groups, as well as a neo-Sufi grouping, which I call traditional, well, a neo-Sufi, I call it neo-Sufi, I mean, they will call themselves followers of traditional Islam. And again, that's a very interesting area, looking at the kind of different kind of types of religious expression and different interpretations of Islam. So again, here you can see the diversity. There's a huge amount of diversity. And to the outsider, it might actually be quite overwhelming and confusing. Are you confused? Are you following this? Well, you will be now. Okay. This is just a diagrammatic from a report that was published last year from the Institute of Community Cohesion, just to kind of give you a sense of some of the kind of different kind of groupings, theological as well as ideological, and I don't necessarily agree with all of them where they've been represented, but it does ring true largely, in that it shows 4 different kind of theological schools within the Sunni tradition, but then there's also the Shia tradition, and within the Sunni school we have different subgroupings, and again they have their connections to the countries of origin of their parents' generation. So again, it's a complex kind of mix of different kinds of understanding, different types of practice of faith, and they relate to the ideological groups which I talked about before. In terms of now, if you're interested in finding out more about the community, there is increasing literature. I've just picked out some of the more kind of significant ones. There are others, but I would recommend to you, if you want to understand more about the Muslim youth experience and the last 2, Young British Muslim and Young British Muslim Voices, which they've taken more of a kind of a national perspective on Muslim youth in the UK. There are specific studies here that look at specific ethnicities. A very significant one was Islam in Transition by Jessica Jacobson, which she looks at Pakistani youth in London. Muslim Britain it's a good collection actually. It gives you an overview of kind of diverse range of issues facing Muslim communities. If you want a good historical survey of Muslims in Britain, Infidel Within is a good read. And there are others. And you probably know there's another book coming out soon by somebody you know sitting in this room. Do you know what I'm talking about? But yeah, it's an increasing subject area, and it's very dynamic. And I would actually point you towards the academic studies rather than some of the journalistic stuff that's coming out, because there is a number of titles out there which don't necessarily give you an objective survey. I'll come on to some of these titles because I'm not saying don't read them all together, but if you really want to understand what's going on, you need to start with this reading list, something like this. There are kind of very good reports that have come out which complement the books produced by various institutions such as Muslim Council of Britain. The Muslim Youth Helpline have produced a very good report. So is Forward Thinking, yeah, I mean, I suppose what it demonstrates is this increasing significance of the youth as a category. Some of the magazines, again, which reflect the second and third generations kind of understanding of themselves and basically providing a platform for them to articulate their religious identity. Magazines like Q News, ML, the Revival magazine, and Trends, but Trends is out of publication now. What's happening also is that Muslim youth are actually writing about themselves, so people in the second and third generation have started to produce books. The first one here, Only Half of Me, is produced by Raghi Omar. I think everyone knows Raghi Omar, the British Somalian journalist. She talks about his experience growing up as a Muslim, as a British Muslim person. One of the other significant titles has been Enemy Combatant, which is it's a memoir produced by Muazzin Beg, who is also a Guantanamo Bay resident, I suppose. And it's a fascinating read actually, because it takes you through his kind of experience of growing up in Britain, being shocked by the events in Bosnia in the mid-90s, and then going off and doing some charity work in Pakistan, the Afghanistan border, and then how he ended up in Guantanamo Bay. I really recommend that. And another book that's been very, very influential, some of you may be aware of it, is the book called The Islamist, by Ed Hussein, which again it gives you an insight into the experiences of a young British Bengali man in the East End of London, and how he became involved in some of these activist groups and what happened to him. The book's very controversial actually, in that a lot of people who he talks about in the book and the particular interpretation of Islamic activism have been challenged by his peers. So it does come with a health warning, but it is a good read, and it does give you a window into the mindset of the kind of militant strand of Muslim youth activism. Now, I just want to start rounding off now in terms of the kind of issues that are really challenging the community, I'd say, and these are again related back to those socio-economic problems which I kind of listed before. I mentioned the fact there's overcrowded housing, education and achievement, unemployment, but coupled with that, and a kind of an aggravating factor is the issue of racism, and racism is alive and well, I'm sorry to say, and it is there. But then you have new forms of it in terms of Islamophobia, blatant discrimination against Muslims, purely on the basis of their faith, the visual appearance, or their practice of religion. And because Islamophobia isn't a crime, it isn't legislated against in any way. When people become victims of Islamophobia, there's not a lot they can do about it really. But it's an everyday reality, and you can't really understand it until you've been on the receiving end. So that again is feeding into very kind of frustrating sense of grievance. If you travel the UK and you meet Muslim young people, you know, 9 out of 10 times they'll complain to you about Islamophobia, you know, and to the point that some people will actually, and if I'm being honest, they will use it as a crutch for not, you know, making more of an effort and trying to kind of better themselves. But it's like racism. People will play the race card. Some Muslims will play the Islamophobic card when it isn't there. Now, you know, I just thought I'd mention that because I think sometimes it's easy to use genuine grievances as a crutch, and I know people who do it. You see, because particularly in communities I've worked in, young men will look for reasons for why they are not actually progressing in life. Okay, and it's a reality that, you know, those of us who worked in those communities have to deal with. And the challenge for us is how do we engage those people? How do we inspire them? How do we get them to actually take responsibility and address those challenges? We've got all these challenges, but how do we move beyond? Because we're not the only community that's struggling. You know, some Muslims like to internalize that and constantly moan and complain about how bad things are, but you know, the fact is there is real discrimination out there. There are real issues. It shouldn't be an excuse. It shouldn't be an excuse for not improving your situation. But there is a general sense of demonization, and that's the thing. Particularly Muslim young men. Having said that, they sometimes can use it as a crutch. There is a real sense of, particularly since 7/7, there's a sense of being a convenient punch bag for projecting all the kind of frustrations people have against Muslims onto Muslim males, and this has become a new kind of a moral panic. I don't know if people are familiar with the work of Sadek Hamid. He's written a book called on moral panics and the folk devils, and he's argued that Muslim males have become a new kind of folk devil. Really, they you know, it's everything we fear about Muslims and Islam can be manifested in the image of a Muslim male. If the Muslim male isn't an antisocial, potentially criminal individual, he can be a terrorist, and that is a dominant representation at the moment. When was the last time you saw a positive image of a Muslim male in the mainstream media? That's a question, open question to anybody. You would struggle. Can anybody give me a Muslim male that is positive? Yeah, I knew you were going to say Amir Khan. Besides Amir Khan. Raghi Omar, yeah, I suppose, arguably, yeah. Well, you can, but the thing is, Raghi Omar is, when you think of Raghi Omar, you tend to think of him as a journalist, as a BBC journalist. You don't tend to think of him as a positive British Muslim role model, which he is, I think. But, you know, in the popular imagination, it's Amir Khan, really. Years ago, back in the 90s, somebody like Imran Khan or Prince Naseem Hamid the boxer, I mean, he was like the Amir Khan of his day. But then you really struggle. You really do struggle. But do we have positive role models within the Muslim community? Do we? Yes. Well, you know, maybe we do, maybe we don't. But certainly in the popular imagination, there's very few positive role models people can identify with, and that's one of the things that we need to work on in the Muslim community. Have figures who can bridge that gap. I'll tell you one positive role model. Yusuf Islam. Cat Stevens. Yeah, Cat Stevens. Junaid Jamshed. Yeah. Does anybody know? To my non-Muslim members of the audience, does anybody know Junaid Jamshed? Have you heard of Junaid Jamshed? Yes. I know you have. He used to be a bit of a Pakistani rock star. He was very famous in Pakistan. But if you don't know that if you're Pakistani, I suppose. But he actually has become, he's undergone quite a dramatic change in his kind of religious practice. He's become very religious, basically. He is seen as a very positive role model for some people. Okay, coming back to the challenges, some of the structural external challenges I was talking about. Political representation is another one that you find time and time again. People will say, look, nobody listens to us. People are always talking about us, writing about what we do, or complaining about what we do, but nobody actually talks to us and lets us speak for ourselves. And this is one of the major grievances you will find when you talk to Muslim youth. Okay? That kind of translates into a feeling of powerlessness. So for example, the Northern Riots of 2001, some people argue were just as much as there were kind of incidents triggered by racism, the racism of the racist provocation of the BNP, but it was also an act of defiance. It was making a statement to the authorities, to wider societies that, look, this is what's going on in our communities here. What are you doing about it? It wasn't the right way, but it was a way of speaking out and making their voices heard. In the same way, African Caribbean young men in the early 80s, in the 81 riots, you know, and this is probably going back before some of you were born, but you know, just have to say for history's sake, you need to know this. Minority communities have had to make their voices heard sometimes in ways that, you know, not necessarily very palatable, but you know, it's changing now. I mean, thankfully we do have some political representation in both houses of Parliament, but they aren't proportional to the number of Muslims in the UK. Nearly done. Okay, internal challenges. Well, what I mean by that is, just as we have the kind of external challenges that are kind of adding to the different layers of difficulty within our communities, and this is going back to what I was saying, but if I'm being honest, okay, there's a lot the Muslim communities need to do to get their own house in order. And these are some of the gaps, these are some of the kind of problems, some of the issues that we have to sort out. One of the reasons that explains some of the kind of alienation and kind of sense of dislocation amongst Muslim youth is the fact that they feel increasingly alienated from their parents' generation. And that's obviously not unique to Muslim communities. But you know, it is a problem where young people don't feel that their parents understand what they're going through, that they can't relate to what they've been through. I mean, they come from a different cultural experience, a different time, and growing up as a British person is very different from growing up in rural Pakistan or Bangladesh or wherever. And people, you know, they don't have the command of the mother tongue as well as their parents would like, and hence, you know, it does make it difficult for people to be able to relate to what their parents' expectations may be or how they want them to live their lives. And you know, this can cause practical kind of challenges when young people need help and support with a particular social problem. Now, you know, I know as somebody who used to work with youth, if a young person has a problem, they're not going to speak to their parents about it, which is common in most cultures. You know, they're definitely not going to go to their local imams, okay? If they're lucky, they might have an elder brother or sister who they can speak to, or some friends they can speak to, but beyond that, where do they go for help? And this is a real critical issue. It's a very serious issue where, especially with the increasing kind of range of problems that young people face, the fact that there aren't people that they can speak to, that they can get support and help from. So the generation gap is just one example. Cultural dislocation, what I mean by that is feeling, in a sense, in between two worlds, not necessarily suffering an identity crisis, but feeling that they need to behave differently in different environments without choice. So for example, at home there are expectations how I behave in front of my parents, my elders. When I'm out with my friends, there's a different kind of peer pressure on me, you know. If I'm in the mosque, again, there's different kinds of limitations. And for some people who don't have the kind of inner resources and skills to navigate this, it can cause serious problems. And those are the people that can actually, you know, have a crisis, and sometimes they suffer mental health problems, depression, and you know, other issues. Positive role model deficit, we've already talked about. One of the biggest problems facing Muslim youth nowadays, and I would argue possibly the biggest problem, is substance addiction. There's a massive drugs problem, believe it or not. You know, Muslims aren't supposed to take drugs, right? Yeah? We're not supposed to drink, we're not supposed to take you know, other kinds of drugs, but you know, increasingly people do, and it's all hidden. It's all hidden. And to aggravate it more, and I'm very embarrassed to say this, a lot of people who are actually supplying drugs in the Muslim community are actually Muslims themselves, and they're importing it from Muslim countries. So it's a huge issue. It's a global issue. It won't be sorted overnight. And again, that impacts into increasing crime and antisocial behaviour, gang-related violence, turf wars, and all sorts of stuff that, you know, you're starting to see more and more of. Things that were never seen 10, 15 years ago are increasing in our inner cities. Added with that is this general sense of apathy, you know, apathy generated from both a sense of having no direction in life, feeling excluded, you know, feeling that there's nobody to give me any, you know, going back to role models, giving people direction, motivation, support, and it results in basically kind of indifference, really. You know, it's very hard to motivate a lot of young people because they think, what's the point? You know, I'm a victim. You know, I'm a Muslim. You know, the whole world's against me. You know, why should I bother? I'm just going to do my thing, and that is a problem. And I'm not exaggerating here. And lastly, and I do put it at the bottom deliberately, radicalisation extremism, which is a real thing. There is a terrorist threat, but I would argue that the whole agenda around violent extremism is being magnified beyond what's actually verifiable, and it's an area which we're still trying to kind of understand. But you know, radicalisation extremism isn't the first thing young people talk about. Okay, there are people operating in our communities who are pushing these kind of messages, but you know, it isn't as anywhere near as large as some people would like you to believe. I'm going to start rounding off now by just quickly kind of pulling out some of the kind of other concerns that young people actually do say that they're suffering. Okay, people. I mean, the Muslim Youth Helpline is one of the leading organisations that actually helps young people in the UK. The various bits and pieces of research that they've done, and they've compiled together in a report that came out in 2007. It's relationships, mental health, religion, and the other two. Those are the four that came out again and again. Now, I don't know if people are surprised by hearing about relationships again, you know, because there is a perception that Muslim youth, you know, Muslims aren't supposed to, you know, engage in any kind of premarital relationships, and they're not, you know, they get married and live happily ever after. The fact of the matter is, young Muslims are doing everything else that their non-Muslim peers are doing, you know, and that has got, you know, there's different dimensions to it. You know, people not only, you know, struggle with the kind of relationships in terms of male-female kind of dynamics, but also feeling pressure to get married. Obviously, we know about forced marriages, but then there's also kind of instances of when people want to get married but they can't get married, and so on. There's lots of stuff there which is just quite complex. Mental health increasingly, as I said, depression, more serious types of kind of psychiatric illness, these are increasing. Suicide as well. Issues around religion are to do with, again, balancing the kind of the two worlds that people occupy, and it's the kind of struggle around being able to practice their religion in this society, which is a secular society, and kind of maintaining a kind of healthy engagement. And this is a kind of massive area in itself, actually, how people actually reconcile the competing demands of modern British life and keeping their identity as Muslims. I think the other two are quite kind of self-evident. Again, sexuality, sexual health, Muslims who feel that they are struggling with their sexual identity, they've got nowhere to go. There's only, well, there's actually 2 organisations, but you know, again, it's a very sensitive issue. What you find is that these things are kind of they're kind of hidden, and you don't really understand, and you're not really aware of these issues unless you actually work with these people on the ground. I just want to wrap up by saying, just listing some of the things again which you won't be surprised with. The ineffective service of a young Muslim relates to the other things which I've talked about in terms of having nowhere to go to seek support. Certainly we know that most Muslims are unhappy with the British government's foreign policy, that's well known. I've just mentioned this thing about integration, having dual identities or multiple identities. For some people it's not a problem, for a lot of people it is. Again, these are some of the things which I've touched on earlier in the presentation. A lot of young people are actually, I mean, maybe I've presented the kind of some of these factors as kind of denying the agency of young people for themselves. You know, in my experience, this has been the case, that young people, I'm talking people in their teenage years and early 20s, have struggled with all of these things. But that's not to say that all young people are, and I want to make that distinction, and I hope that comes across, is that whilst a lot of people have no problem, you know, they're perfectly healthy, perfectly confident, educated, successful young people, they're going into, you know, very kind of secure and confident adults. A lot of them aren't, you know, they're not doing very well, and they're struggling with it, and there isn't a support systems either internally in the community or externally that actually understand how to address these issues. And this is something I'm kind of involved in myself, and I'll talk about it a little bit later if I've got time. And I think we're coming to the end now. Now, just want to leave you with a couple of slides. Going back to when people talk about Muslim youth, British Muslim youth, let's be honest, we tend to think of these types of negative images, right? But what I would say to you, that these people are in the minority, okay? The majority of Muslim youth tend to be people who aspire and live the lives of people like Amir Khan. I don't know if anybody knows Sami Yusuf. He's a pop star. He's actually a friend of mine from Manchester. He's done very well, you know, and he's seen by a lot of people as a positive role model from what he's done. And Sarah Joseph, who's quite a prominent convert, second generation, and she's an editor of Emma magazine. These people are far more representative of British Muslim youth today than the very negative imagery that you say. So I just want you to take away that message. Muslim communities are complex, Muslim youth communities are diverse. There are many, many issues, and a lot of these issues and challenges are unresolved. But there are people working on the ground, there are agencies that are trying to deal with this, but it will take time. And I think I'll leave it at that. So thank you for your attention, and welcome to
Thank you once again to Sadek. I think we're opening the floor to questions. We have quite a lot of time for questions remaining if people are interested. So just put your hand if you're interested. At the back.
Yes.
I'm doing a project on like interreligious dialogue from the perspective of young people, and I was just wondering, you said a lot about like how Muslim youth, like they feel that like they're perceived, but do they have any kind of perceptions of other religions? Do they have any sort of prejudices? Have you ever come across it in your youth work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't say if I'm not aware. I don't know if Sophie is with research around Muslim perceptions of non-Muslim in terms of a youth category. I think there are kind of bits and pieces of research I've seen around kind of small scale that tend to be interfaith projects or community cohesion projects where you've got Muslim and non-Muslim youth working together and exchanging and sharing kind of their experiences. There are, on a practical level, I could point you in that direction because I'm involved in it myself. But kind of substantial reports and research, I'm not aware. So.
Have you had any personal experience of it? You don't mind me asking, like any with the youth work that you've done. Have you had any experience with the youth groups? Kind of having a problem or not?
Well, in terms of about kind of like interfaith relations, you mean in terms of?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean there are, like I said, there are projects up and down the country that are actually doing very positive interfaith work. Yeah, yeah. I mean I'm involved in an organisation in Oldham called Peacemaker, for example, which we bring together young people from different backgrounds. They tend to be predominantly white and Asian, and you know, people who are religious and people who are not religious. So that's one example out of many. And they do talk about faith, but they tend to talk about so many other things as well.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's like I said, it depends on who you're talking about, because as I said, most Muslim young people say, well, they might have a strong personal attachment, an emotional attachment to their religion. They're not necessarily religious.
Yeah.
They won't talk about religion with each other or with, you know, with a non-Muslim friend. You know, there's so many things to be talking about. You know, so. But yeah, I can give you more information if you want me to. Okay.
Any questions? Sarah?
I had a couple of questions just for the sake of information.
Sure.
One was, if you don't mind, just a couple if there's time, if the chair will allow. First of all, you said that a lot of the people in prison, from what I understood, were younger rather than older. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes.
So when you talk about the age group, it's quite overrepresented. Ages, what, 20 to 18 to 30 or whatever, something like that.
Yeah.
So when you talk about drug offences, is that predominantly drug usage or drug trafficking?
Trafficking.
Right, so a lot of it is criminal.
Yeah, it is criminal activity.
Okay.
Yes.
My second question was that when you say that a lot of the young people, you don't, a lot of them, although they may identify with certain religious markers, for example, they're not particularly practicing, quote unquote. So how does one, I mean, is that a comment anecdotally, or is there work that's been done?
No, this is just a kind of, I was making a generalization based on various specific researches. I mean, like the list I've kind of alluded to, there are, you know, various pieces of research both in the UK and Europe and America to suggest that Western Muslim youth are, there's a dual kind of phenomenon taking place in that people are leaving or becoming more secularized or culturalized to a dominant secular kind of lifestyle, but at the same time there are significant numbers of youth becoming more committed to their faith. So both things are happening at the same time, but people who are not religious, if you like, or exhibiting the identity markers or clearly kind of stating that they are, you know, personally devout, they are in the minority. That's
so my third question, I think finally, is about the class, actually, how the class breaks down. So if you have, I mean, you said Indian versus Pakistanis, Bangladeshi, so in a way that's predictable just because of the first generation, if you can call it that. So
why is it predictable?
Well, in a way because I imagine that in a lot of Indian Muslims coming from Indian origin coming out of East Africa in the 70s, so they're coming from relatively middle class bourgeois backgrounds with business oriented backgrounds, whereas Pakistani, Bengali coming from rural backgrounds, a lot of them overrepresented in a way from Mirpur, for example, in this country. So what I'm interested in is that when you talk about an emerging middle class happening, is that middle class occurring from, you know, a continuation of that middle class, or are you getting a middle class developing out of that rural class, out of the Pakistani, Bengali? That's what I'm trying to understand. So is it a pre-existing middle class continuing, where their parents have been educated, the children, they're aspirational for their children, etc., or are you getting an emerging middle class out of what are really, you know, rural people coming here doing manual labour, for example?
Sure. Yes, you're right. I mean, I just wanted to clarify, in terms of the Indian Muslim communities, and we were talking specifically of the Gujarati communities, they have greater social capital in that, as you rightly said, they've come from predominantly East Africa, where there's settled communities of generations, and you know there is a different kind of educational, entrepreneurial kind of mindset which they've kind of transferred over into this country and their children. So there's a great emphasis on education and achievement. It's very clear, really. It's a very clear difference between them and say the Pakistani Bengali communities, which are predominantly coming from rural backgrounds, uneducated, whose parents or fathers came and worked in the manual labour kind of positions that are available in the 60s and 70s. And to answer your question, what I can see, it's those young people whose families have encouraged or who themselves are individually motivated, have climbed the social ladder. There's been social mobility as a result of education. Education has been the determining factor for them, you know, becoming middle class, and that is evident. Certainly, it's evident in Pakistani and the Bengali communities, and even in newer, relatively newer communities such as the Somali communities, who are have only been here about 20 years. You know, them fleeing kind of political kind of places of conflict. I know some of my friends who came in the late 80s, you know, didn't have anything, but you know they went through the education system, they went into higher education. Some of them are, a lot of them are, they've gone into more accountancy, and some of them have started their own businesses, and so that's that. In a very short period of time, you've seen that social mobility take place, and it's purely as a result of education and having higher aspirations. So you see that, and I think that's, it's a common pattern.
Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Perhaps to the back, Nabil and then Ross.
I was reading, I think it's the Times, and they're talking about the increase in Muslim population.
Yeah.
The figure that they quoted was it's increasing 10 times more than the common normal population.
I don't know if it's 10 times more, but it's gone to, they claim through the Labour Force, so it's gone to 2.4 million. You're talking about that one, yeah?
Yeah, and they sort of related that to house prices increasing and stuff like that. I mean, I found that a bit sort of uncomfortable, because you have a large community, and yet you sort of in these statistics you're sort of combining into and making into sort of like one community, and that's sort of feeding into public fears as well. I mean, do you think it's helpful having these statistics?
Well, yeah, okay, that's a good question. I'm not sure about the details because I haven't actually seen. I only read the article like itself. I haven't seen the report myself. I don't know if Sophie's read it yet. The new figures, and I don't know what the effects of it could be. I mean, certainly in a paper like the Times, which tends to be more conservative, and there's a greater proportion of hostile coverage, shall we say, relatively speaking. I think it does tap into people's fears about Muslim presence in the UK. Yeah, I agree with you there. There is a kind of concerted campaign by certain quarters of the media establishment, as well as individual journalists, to play up the Muslim threat, and how they do that is they focus on the increasing Muslim population. Some people talk about Eurabia. There's actually a book called Eurabia, and I'm talking about the demographic projections for the Muslim community in the next 50 years. So what they're saying, basically arguing bottom line, is that Muslims are having more babies, and they're doing it having at such a rate that it's going to displace the majority population of the white European races in the next 50 years. So, for example, Britain will become almost 50% Muslim, and other kind of claims like that. And I think for a lot of people, especially at this current time when there's a lot of anxiety around Muslims and Islam and terrorism, it's not helpful. I don't think it provides further ammunition for far right groups like the BNP to say, oh, these Muslims are taking over, oh my God. So I don't know. I'd have to see the research and see how they compile it and see how true it is.
Thank you. Just finishing with Rose, if that's okay.
Okay, Do you think that religious education in mainstream schools is adequate in helping young people, both Muslim and non-Muslim, to understand the diversity of their generation?
Good question. I can't really comment in any detail because I can't claim to have looked at the syllabi in any detail. Because I know it depends, which school you're looking at. There's different kind of levels of quality and content. Certainly, I think one of the things that will help us is to have a greater appreciation of difference, and religious education, having kind of studied world religions within the state sector as well as private schools, and I'm including Muslim schools here as well. I think it's very important because you can only really understand somebody and value somebody's back if you kind of spend time studying it. So yeah, in a simple answer, yes, I think so.
Thank you. Okay, so if you can have a round of applause for Sadek.
Can I just make a quick plug before you all go? I don't know, most of you, the students here, you're on courses already, but if you know anybody who wants to tackle some of the challenges which I presented here to you today, and train and become professional youth workers, we've got a course at Chester University which is the only one in the country designed specifically to train people to become professional Muslim youth workers. If you're interested, I've got some more literature here. Thank you for listening.